Good afternoon. My name is Richard Green. I am director of the USC Lusk Center for Real Estate, and this is the fall 2021 Casden Multifamily Housing Forecast. Our agenda for today is to talk about some things that are on many people's minds who are thinking about the world of multifamily housing. Inflation, something we haven't talked about in quite some time that is now on everybody's lips. Interest rates, infrastructure, coastal markets, taxes, and maybe a little bit on the Federal Reserve before we get into the forecast. So there is pressure right now on the goods market. And the first reason for it is if we just look at how much income there is out there, it is considerable. This is real disposable per capita income in the US. What you can see is that it rose and then dropped and then rose and then dropped. The rises reflect those stimulus checks that we know about, the 3 rounds of stimulus. But the really important thing to look at is if you look at the trend in real per capita personal income, disposable income is the upward trend. And again, this is adjusting for inflation, was basically not interrupted by COVID. We are where we would have expected to be had COVID never happened right now. Take a look at that. And so people have income, okay? What are they spending it on? Well, I think this is one of the reasons we're seeing inflationary pressure. So in the immediate aftermath of COVID, we saw big decreases in spending on both services and goods, but bigger declines in services than goods. And if you look, when it comes to service spending, we're still not back to where we were before COVID. Whereas when we look at goods spending, we are well past where we were at the beginning of COVID. That's almost a 20% increase in goods spending. So what's going on? People have this money. We showed you that. They're not spending it on services. What does that mean? It means they're not getting haircuts. They're not getting their nails done. They're not going to the doctor, although there's been some catch up in that in the last year or so. But just think of all the services that you spend money on and how you're not spending money on them recently because you're staying home, right? You have to leave home in order to buy services. People have not been leaving home. So they have money. They're not spending the money on services. What are they going to do? Well, people want to spend their money. They have buy buttons on their computers. And so they're buying stuff. They're buying lots and lots and lots of stuff. And the thing about the manufacturing process and the supply chain process is it's not something that can be immediately expanded. So if you're close to capacity, then if you spend a lot more, it's going to show up in prices and not in output. And goods, unlike services, can't adjust quickly to this change in demand. So that's putting a lot of upward pressure on prices right now. Okay. Will this go away any time soon? Well, I'm sort of doubtful. And here's the reason why is despite the fact that we've been spending all this money on goods, we've also been saving a lot until quite recently relative to what we did in the past. And even if you look at this recent savings rate, other than the spike here in the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis, we're still saving more than we've saved at any time in the last 30 years, more or less. So what you could say is what's here is the unspent money that people have that could potentially go to new spending. Unless they get tired of buying stuff. And so this will continue to put inflationary pressure on the markets. The other thing is people do decide to leave home and do decide to spend more on services, that could relieve pressure. But in the absence of that, in the absence of people getting tired of buying goods or people deciding to spend their money on services again, there's no reason to think these inflationary pressures won't be with us for at least a while longer, okay? At the same time, the other place where there's a bottleneck is not as many people are working. And if you look at where we are in terms of total employment, we're at about 2 million people, still fewer people working now than was the case 2 years ago. And let me restate that. If you look at the share of the working age population that's working now compared to 2 years ago, it's still about 2 percentage points lower. So this is the total number of people working divided by the population age between the ages of 15 and 64, which is what we consider to be the prime working age population. So fewer people working, harder to produce as much stuff, again, is going to put some inflationary pressure on. At the same time, the number of people who are working age population is actually falling right now. This is not the share of the working age population which is falling. This is the total number of people who are of working age is falling, and it will continue to fall over the course of the next decade as the large number of baby boomers between the ages of 55 and 64 head into that 65 to 74-year-old age range, at which they will likely at some point cease working. And one of the interesting things about COVID is after years and years and years in which people have pushed back their retirement age, we have seen people at least state that they are retiring at a younger age than before, which will put even more pressure on the economy because we won't have these workers able to contribute to it unless we change immigration policy, of course. Okay, here's another indication of where we are relative to the past in terms of capacity. So 40% of the imports coming into the United States come through the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. And this is where Los Angeles is in terms of TEUs. So think of those containers that come through, moving through each month. And so the blue is a month for 2019. The yellow is a month for 2021. The red is 2020. Obviously, we don't have the last 3 months of 2020 yet available in terms of, 2021. But note this, in October, November, December of last year, far more stuff moving through than was the case in the previous year. We look at January, not quite 2019, but February, much more, March, much more, April, May, June, little less in July, more in August, more in September. 2019 was a record year for stuff moving through the Port of Los Angeles. And in nearly every month in the last 12, we've been moving more stuff through that port than we did in that record-breaking year. So the question is, are we at capacity in terms of the port? Well, it would appear so if you look at the number of ships sitting off of San Pedro right now. It would appear that more stuff can't move through. But interestingly, we had Jamie Lee, who's the chair of the Port Commission at the Casden event, and she said the issue is not so much the port itself. It could have more stuff move through it. It's the lack of truckers picking stuff up and moving it out. And she said that there is a shortage of 30,000 truckers, go back to your labor, the labor supply at the moment, that are preventing us from having stuff picked up, which is causing a bottleneck at the port, which again, of course, is inflationary. It's important to remember that the impact of this has not been the same on everyone. If we look at unemployment rate based on race, if we look at it for white folks, I mean, everybody saw their unemployment rate rise dramatically at the beginning of COVID, but it rose more for Black folks than white folks. And if you look at where we are now in terms of the difference between Black unemployment and white unemployment and compare it to before COVID, that gap has expanded again. So as is often the case, people who are sort of struggling most in our society are harmed most by these traumatic events, despite the government interventions that we have put into place in order to help. Let's talk about interest rates. And this is something that I'm wondering about the sustainability of in the years to come, but it also explains why capitalization rates are as low as they are. This is the TIP rate, or the 10-year constant maturity inflation indexed interest rate. So let me explain how this works. Currently, the real interest rate in the United States is -1%. So you can buy a security and it works like this. It says, okay, you spend $100 on it. What are you gonna have in a year for a coupon? Well, you'll have -$1. So do you have to give the government $1? Well, we're not there yet. Plus the growth in CPI, which has been clicking along at between 5 and 6%. So what it would say is a year from now, you get a $4 coupon for that $100 that you invested today, right? The 5% nominal rate minus the 1% real rate that you're taking on. This is the relevant benchmark for capitalization rates, because what a cap rate is a rate of return minus a growth rate. Your total return on a property is your cap rate plus your growth rate. So rate of return minus your growth rate is your cap rate. And so if you look at the margin between capitalization rates and tip rates at the moment, they're actually pretty high by historical standards, which suggests that they are not overly compressed at the moment. Relative to relative benchmark, you are getting a good margin with cap rates, which makes, again, apartments very appealing. And when you add to that the fact that apartment rents are rising more rapidly, in fact, much more rapidly than inflation, it makes apartments even more appealing. Now, the question is, will these rapid rises in rents continue to increase? And we'll talk about that when we get to the forecast. Okay, logistics. If we're thinking about the cities that will succeed going forward, they are going to be the ones that have the best logistics. And so it's worth spending a minute to talk about the context in which Southern California sits. A very important logistic for getting people and goods in and out of a place is, do you have a runway? Do you have an airport with 4 parallel runways? So the thing about having 4 parallel runways is even bad weather has minimal impacts on the outflow and inflow of air traffic at such an airport. You have 2 runways with planes leaving, you have 2 runways with planes arriving, you don't have planes interfering with each other in airspace as a result of this, and so you can get very efficient flows. This is a list of all the airports in the United States with 4 or more parallel runways: Atlanta, Denver, Dallas, Detroit, Los Angeles, Orlando, and Chicago. It's no accident that many of these have been fast growth cities going back 50 years. Chicago, not so much. And of course, Detroit, not so much. But it still is something that gives all of them an advantage relative to other cities. Now, for those of you who fly through SFO, you know that the weather there will cause delays and cancellations very easily, very quickly. And that's because their 4 runways intersect with each other. They're like a hashtag. Instead of in parallel. And so this is an important advantage LA has, and explains why before COVID, it was the #1 origin and destination airport in the world, which is to say, if you remove the people changing planes, it had more air traffic than any other airport in the world, why it was the #2 commercial airport period in the United States, and why it was the #2 cargo airport in the United States. The 2 main cargo airports in the US, of course, are Memphis, which is FedEx's hub, and Louisville, which is UPS's, and they have only 3 and 2 parallel runways respectively, but they have very little passenger traffic, so that's adequate for their purposes. Where LA doesn't do so well is roads, California. So we need to get stuff in and out of the ports, and I know roads are things that people tend to not like very much nowadays. You read people complaining that we should have fewer of them, not more of them. If that's the case, then California is in good shape, because California, for all of our reputation of being a freeway-laden place, has amongst the fewest lane miles per capita of any state in the country. Okay, so what does that mean? It even takes into account the fact that LA freeways are 8 lanes across, 10 lanes across, et cetera. We don't have that much road capacity relative to the number of people who live here. Now, the other thing is, if you compare what are the places with less, New Jersey, Hawaii, District of Columbia, those are very small, very dense places. And California, of course, has a lot of density, but there's a lot of places that are not so dense. It's an enormous state. So those are places where you would expect there to be less in terms of roads per capita. And if you go to the far right, you want to ignore, far left, excuse me, you want to ignore these places: North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana. They don't have people, and they have roads that cross the entire state, which we do have a national system of highways, so you need roads that get all the way across them. So you get this very large amount of capacity relative to the number of people. So that's not really particularly relevant, but it is interesting to look at, places that we consider our competitors, like Texas, and I would argue Washington State, have considerably more road capacity than California does. And it's just something to think about as we're thinking about the importance of moving stuff through the supply chain and Los Angeles's role in that. There's some other things to consider is coastal markets in general, and LA market in particular, in terms of performance going back 23 years. And there's a good news, bad news aspect to the story, but the way to look at this is we're looking at just average CPI growth per year. in residential rent. And you see Los Angeles has rent growth of 4% per year, highest of any market in the country over that period of time. San Francisco is number 2 at about 3.7, 3.8%. Houston is under 3, Atlanta is under 2.5, Dallas is a little under 3. From the standpoint of an investor, of course, this is great. It means the cap rate should be lower in these markets because you would expect rent to grow. And there's a reason we're not building much stuff here. And so that makes sense. Of course, from the standpoint of housing affordability, this is terrible and explains why LA is amongst the worst, if not the worst place in the country when it comes to housing affordability. But the other thing I want you to look at is the volatility of that growth. And the orange bar is the standard deviation of rent growth in these various markets. And what you can see is LA, while it has the highest rent growth, it does not have the highest volatility. I find it interesting that Atlanta has the highest rent volatility. In a sense, Atlanta, a place that has boomed as an economy over the last 23 years, has not been a particularly great place, at least based on these metrics, for investing in apartments. I divide return by the standard deviation to get what's called a modified Sharpe ratio. It's not exactly the same thing, but the idea is how much return you get in exchange for a unit of risk. And as you can see by that metric, Atlanta does the worst of any of these cities. Chicago does the best of any of these cities. You haven't had a lot of rent growth, but there's very little volatility. It just sort of reliably goes up by a little more than inflation year after year after year. But by this measure, again, the higher the silver bar, the better. LA is pretty good. Not quite as good as New York, not as good as Chicago, but better than all of the other metropolitan areas listed in this. And so, people sometimes wonder, okay, why do people invest in LA? And sometimes people say, oh, I'm not investing in LA because I don't like the progressives there. There's the CEO of a very large REIT who actually said that. But at the end of the day, from an investor standpoint, the performance in LA has outpaced the rest of the country. But also, again, from a resident standpoint, from an affordability standpoint, it's kind of been a nightmare. Okay, just a little bit about taxes. I mean, we're in the middle now of continuing negotiations of the Build Back Better plan. I don't know what's going to happen, but people are worried about what happens if like-kind exchanges go away or if step-up basis at the time of inheritance goes away. So the way it works right now is if you have a property that, say, has a basis of $1 million and it's worth $10 million, if you were to sell it, you pay capital gains tax on the difference. But if you die and your heirs inherit it, the basis steps up to 10 million. And so they could sell it for 10 million and not pay capital gains tax. I'm sure everybody who's watching this knows about like-kind exchanges. The way to defer a capital gains event is if you want to sell a building, instead of selling it for cash, you exchange it for another building and you defer to the point when you sell that building, unless you die before that building is sold. And again, it steps up in basis. You either are putting off your taxes, or again, if someone else inherits, perhaps eliminating that tax liability at all. So I looked at the effective tax rate on this particular deal, and this is just federal income tax rate. It's in California, apartment, 5% cap rate, entry and exit, maybe it should be lower than that. Building to value ratio, so what you can depreciate at 50%, 2% annual NOI growth, maybe it should be higher than that. 60% loan to value ratio, interest only loan at 3%, all in ordinary income tax rate of 50 and all in capital gains tax rate of 33. So this is excuse me, I said federal before, this takes into account California taxes as well. All right, so what is your all in tax without any preferences? It would be 27%. If what the like-kind exchange does is reduces that effective rate to 25%. And what the step up in basis does is reduce it to 24%. So is there an impact if these things go away? Absolutely. Is it enormous? Well, I guess you could think about it. It's about a 10% tax increase. You can decide for yourself whether that's an enormous impact or not on the property markets. Okay, to the forecast. So before we get into the forecast for this 6-month period and this year, I do want to hold myself accountable for what we did last spring, and our forecast did not do particularly well last spring. This is what I call my wall of shame. What did we forecast and what actually happened? And long answer short, rents went up everywhere faster than we said that they were going to go up. My only excuse, if you can call it that, is I don't think anyone was seeing that Irvine would have a 19.2% increase in rent over a 6-month period. If somebody did out there, I'd love to hear about it and how you figured that out. We didn't do that badly. If we sort of look regionally, the places we thought would be weakest were kind of weakest. The places we thought would be strongest were kind of strongest. But this increase in rent was really quite extraordinary. And it was driven by the fact that vacancy rates, already low, dropped even further over the period of time that we studied. And so that's going to be, so remember, if you look and see what we wrote last spring, when we were forecasting rent increase in the Inland Empire of annual rent increases of 10%, we were writing, man, we are, I don't know, this that makes sense. And if you look, you got, this is again in 6 months, for Palm Springs, 6%, West Riverside County, about 10, Rancho Cucamonga, 9. Again, those are 6-month increases in rent. So considerably more than we were expecting. So again, with trepidation, let me show you what we think is going to happen in the year to come. Okay, so Inland Empire, again, one of the things that's going on here, crazy low vacancy. So the vacancy rate at which rents neither rise nor fall on an inflation-adjusted basis is about 5%. We think vacancies which have dropped to 2 are going to stay there. And the reason for that is the Inland Empire has a very strong economy. Employment growth has been very good. And at the same time, we don't see a lot of deliveries coming online, in part because of COVID phenomenon and the supply chain phenomenon. So when you have vacancy that's very low, what do you expect? You expect rents to increase quite rapidly, as we do. And we think in 2 years, rents in the Inland Empire will be well above $2,000 a month. To put this in some perspective, for rents to be considered affordable, you need to be making $80,000 a year in income if you're at $2,000 a month. Will there be people in the Inland Empire who can afford this? Well, if you have 2 people working in an Amazon warehouse at $20 an hour, sharing an apartment, yeah, that gets you to about $80,000 a year. But the key is doubling up. Is if somebody on one income, I think this is pretty hard for people to afford. And the Inland Empire used to be the place that we would say go if you're looking for affordability. Okay. Well, a big reason for this, again, is we don't expect deliveries to be particularly strong. And a lot of this reflects the fact that COVID has done a couple of things. One is it just slowed down the construction process. So deliveries are taking longer even for starts. But the other thing is, because of the supply chain issues, materials are becoming so much more expensive because labor is becoming so much more expensive. Developers are looking at stuff that's permitted and they're saying, wow, we need to get really high incomes in order to justify this construction cost. And so they have delayed beginning new construction, hoping against hope that some of these construction costs come down. Now, the interesting thing is, talking to some developers in the last couple of weeks, because of these strong rents, they're thinking they're going to go forward anyway, which suggests that maybe deliveries will be a little better than we're suggesting here. We look at Los Angeles County, similar sort of story. Vacancies came down much more than we were expecting in the second quarter. As you can see, we were at above 5% vacancy in COVID, and that's why we thought we'd basically not see rent growth in most of LA County over the last 6 months, but stuff got absorbed quite rapidly. People have been coming back to Southern California after living in their parents' house for a while. And what we expect that to continue. And again, deliveries are not going to start to have an impact on those vacancy rates until about 2 years out from now. And again, as a result of that, we expect to see very strong increases in rent. In percentage terms, not as strong as the rest of the region, but nevertheless quite strong. And again, deliveries, we do think when we look at permitted stuff that there will be some stuff coming online toward the end of the second year of our forecast, which again is what's driving those higher vacancy statistics. When we look at Orange County, again, very similar story to LA County, only a little more so, vacancy a little lower to begin with, some deliveries coming online leading to somewhat higher vacancy. Again, still well below that 5%. So we expect rent growth every quarter in the next 2 years. And again, a pretty strong increase, a really substantial increase. Orange County, again, very strong economy, very desirable place, not enough stuff coming online. So for Orange County, excuse me, to make a dent in its housing issues, it needs to be building more like 9,000 units a year, and it's building fewer than 4,000 a year. And so we expect the rents to continue to go up. San Diego, again, the pattern is very similar. If you look at these vacancy patterns for Orange County, for Los Angeles County, a little higher, but you can see that sort of U-shape to it. Again, rent, very strong increases, same reasons. Here's your deliveries, more in the shorter term than the longer term. But we will start to see having an impact on vacancy, we think. And then finally, Ventura, very similar story again. Rents, again, rising quite rapidly. Deliveries, not so great. Now, one of the things about Ventura is you're looking at these very low levels of delivery and you're wondering, okay, how can those vacancy rates be going up? Well, first of all, Ventura County is just a much smaller county than these others. As you know, LA County is 10 million, Orange County is 3, the Inland Empire is 4.5 million, San Diego County is well over 3, Ventura County is about 800,000 people. And so you don't need as many units built in Ventura to have an impact. But the other thing, and this is an artifact of the model, because Ventura hasn't built very much, as you can see, we haven't seen a lot of people move into Ventura. There hasn't been a lot of absorption there because there's been nothing to absorb. And so our forecast absorption is pretty low. That might be a problem with the model, and maybe you'll see more, in which case these vacancy rates will be lower in Ventura and rents will go up even more. So that's a very quick overview of what we expect to see here in Southern California in the next year. My name is Richard Green. My email is richarkg@usc.edu. I welcome any comments or questions. Thank you for watching.